This is a good segue talking about how we recreate some of those water cooler type conversations. Sarah Milstein is a senior director of engineering at Mailchimp. She's somebody I've been lucky to count as a friend and a colleague for a long time across many companies and endeavors. Sarah wrote 2 articles about remote work that are among the very few articles about remote work that have actually shifted my perspective and challenged my assumptions in a meaningful way. And we are super, super, super lucky to have her joining us today. So Sarah.
Sorry about that. So glad to be here.
So glad you're here. No worries. We are all in this experiment together. I'm on a video call with Sarah, which feels like a pretty regular Thursday to me. So so happy that we can share this conversation with a broader audience.
Yeah.
So let's dig right into it. Again, you've written a number of really, really, really thoughtful articles about remote work. The thing that struck me the most is that in the past, a lot of people, admittedly, including myself, have thought of remote work as kind of this low fidelity proxy for in-person work. It's like in-person work is the golden ideal of how we work together. And if you have to, you find a way to get as close to it as possible using remote tools and technologies. You raised the idea that this might not be true at all, that there might be some things that are different and maybe even better in terms of how teams collaborate and build trust in a distributed way. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I noticed a little while ago that I actually prefer working on remote teams. It's not just that I prefer working from home, which I do tend to like. I get to work on my treadmill. But I actually liked working with remote teams better. And I heard myself say to a colleague one day, I like remote teams more because they're inherently more trusting. And that's really counterintuitive. It's not what people tend to think about remote teams at all. It's usually the opposite. And so I started to do some research about why that might be true, that I had that experience. And there were a couple of things I learned. And I think it's important to have as a background idea that trust is one of the most important things in the workplace. That's very well documented that people have better experiences at work when they feel trusted and when they trust their colleagues, and the work outcomes are much better. People are able to talk about difficult things when they have trust, so you can make better progress as teams and tackle bigger problems. So trust is hugely important. And what I learned about remote work is that there's a lot of research about trust at work that was done well before the time that remote work was common, and certainly in the before times, but that pointed out some things that might help me understand what I was experiencing. So one is that there's a concept of swift trust on certain kinds of teams where people come together to do work in teams in a particular way, which I'll talk about in a sec. And it's canonically understood to be situations that help people develop trust very quickly because of the conditions. And the conditions in swift trust tend to be similar in software organizations as they are in the organizations that were studied like 25 years ago when this was developed as an idea. The idea is that people who have different kinds of skills that need to come together and work cross-functionally, but have defined projects and pretty clear outcomes, tend to be able to work together very quickly and can build trust easily. The main example of this is movie sets. Everybody has very different skills. They come together for a period of time and then they disperse. In software teams, you may stay at your company, but you might get assigned to another team, and those other pieces are really true. So swift trust seems like that's part of the underlying thing that we need, and that's true no matter where you are. It doesn't require being in person. I think the other thing is that it turns out that people have different kinds of propensity for trust, personal propensity to trust other people. And I think what I was finding is that I have a pretty high propensity to trust people. And I tend to feel trusted in remote organizations, and I connect with other people who feel that way. If you're high trust, you don't need to see the people to feel that you're doing the work together, you need to see the work typically. People who have a lower propensity for trust, which is not a judgment, it's just sort of a different way people operate in the world, tend to build trust up in part by seeing each other in person, and they feel trusted by being seen at work. Whereas people with a high propensity for trust, the idea that you have to show up at the office every day can feel kind of paternalistic and sort of irrelevant. So I think there's a couple of interesting aspects of trust that help us understand why remote and like fully distributed teams might work a little better than in-person teams where people need to prove things or where they have different assumptions about how the teams are going to work in order to get things done.
That's really interesting. The distinction between seeing the people and seeing the work is, I think, a really important one for product development teams in particular to be aware of. I know you and I are both big advocates of demoing things early and often, and it's all the more case for why it's important for those teams to stay super focused on the work they're doing together, as opposed to just the those moments of well, I don't want to say those moments of personal connection, because I think part of what you're saying, if I'm not mistaken, is that when you work on something together, seeing that work builds that connection in a way that might be surprising. So related to that, part of what I really liked about your framing of all this is that it's starting with these big issues of trust. It's a very kind of high level reframing of what distributed work means versus co-located work. And thinking more about this distinction between seeing the work and seeing each other also kind of gets there. Most of the conversations I have about this start or end with somebody saying, okay, but what are the tools? Like, yeah, trust, yeah, seeing the work, sure. But what's the one magical tool we can use that will make our distributed work feel like we're together in an office again? How do you feel about the tools question, and how does that relate to these ideas of trust and of seeing the work and doing the work together?
Yeah, I mean, you need tools, but I agree with you. But that's not the place to start. I think much more it's important to look at the kinds of collaboration and connection that you need, and then start to look at both the tools you need for that, but as you talked about before, the norms around using them. That's probably the most important piece of it, that you develop social norms. We have social norms in person for how we connect and collaborate, and you need to rethink those and be very intentional when you're trying new tools. That's probably one of the most important things you can do, is understand that when you're using new tools, a lot of what you need to do is say, we can see that we want to be able to brainstorm in a way we used to, or we know, as David mentioned earlier, we want to be able to have that sense of just like tapping somebody on the shoulder and asking a quick question. And you have to brainstorm ideas for how are we going to be able to do that. You have to get a little meta and say, we can recognize we have these problems or these needs. What are some things that we might try? And set up some experiments. Say we want to try this, we think X is going to happen as a result, we're going to do it 3 times or for 3 weeks or 3 months, and we're going to put a date in the calendar and check and see if it worked. And I think that's probably the most important thing you can do in approaching new tools, is thinking more about how you use them than the actual technology.
Yes, love that answer. Yeah, I think we've all been through this, where teams blame the tool for what is basically a team challenge and switch the tool and then wind up with the exact same problem set they had, but with a new tool.
Yeah.
So huge believer in having that conversation about how, and most importantly, why are we using this tool together? So you make a really great case for the value of distributed work. I also appreciate that you frame this also as a matter of personal propensity, which is to say not everybody is going to take to a remote team exactly the same way. And the fact of a team being distributed does not intrinsically create immediate, swift trust, but is rather this sort of complex equation with different personal and team variables. I wanted to ask you about counterexamples. Like, what about teams that fail to build trust, teams that go into a distributed working environment and trust dissipates and they have negative outcomes. What are some of the warning signs or the characteristics you've observed on those teams?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that a lot of it are teams that are trying to, as you say, sort of replicate the in-person experience in a lo-fi way. So what you tend to see are too many Zoom meetings, which in person, everybody already says they have too many meetings. And that's less a function of meetings or Zoom and more that people haven't thought about why are we meeting. Sometimes the content is clear, but there's a question of, are we meeting for social connection? Are we meeting to make a decision? Are we meeting to share information? There's different meta reasons for meetings. And if you think through those carefully, that is all the more important when you're distributed, but it's also, you know, a low trust environment in in-person situations when you have meetings that are not well defined. I think similarly, always on Slack, the idea, or WhatsApp, or whatever your chat tool is, the idea that you are available all the time. And if you're not available, somehow you're not to be trusted, as if you aren't working or not somehow taking work seriously. I think that is one of the biggest signs. And also, as somebody asked in the chat earlier, if there's no end to the day, that's also a sign. Like there's not, if work and life are bleeding into each other, and again, this is true in regular workplaces, not just newly remote. If there's no end to the day, it's hard for individuals to get the distance they need to take a break. It's hard for teams to know when do we stop. And that bleeding, the lack of boundaries, leads to lack of trust.
Makes sense.
Those are a few.
It's funny, one thing I feel like I've observed during this time, which is a challenge to a lot of teams working in agile methodologies, is that doing status updates in synchronous meetings is really boring and bad for a lot of people. Saying like, we're gonna get together and everyone's just gonna read the book report of what they've worked on. When you think about it, there are a lot of reasons why that could lead to a low trust environment where it starts to feel like your job is to justify your existence, not to actually work together towards a collaborative outcome. So it's been interesting to see more teams move status updates into asynchronous communication channels and start to become more mindful about how they can do work together during synchronous time. And also to think about what that meant for their teams before.
Yeah, exactly. And status updates are like the perfect example of a thing that is not actually a great use of FaceTime, whether that's over Zoom or in person. They can be better done asynchronously, but that doesn't mean you don't need regular check-ins. I was talking with somebody at Mailchimp who's on a team that was formed very recently to do some work for customers in this era. And one of the things they decided to try was what they called a warm up and a cool down every day, which sounds like twice daily stand-ups. They started off with some status sharing and then quickly realized they could do that asynchronously. And what they wanted to do was spend the mornings planning what needed to get done, and the afternoon, the cool down part, talking about what actually happened, what got blocked, what was more successful than they thought. And they were really using that time very productively in a much different way than just status updates. And that made them think, oh, maybe we should do this in the future.
That's awesome. That's a great example. One last question for you. You wrote these articles before all this happened.
Yeah.
What have you seen that's surprised you or changed your perspective since we've entered this moment of working from home during a very stressful moment for the world?
Yeah, there are a couple things. I think maybe the thing that surprised me the most is that, well, unsurprisingly, a lot of people have said they are individually less productive right now.
Yeah.
Kind of course, especially got kids at home, but it's a pandemic. You had all the gifts that showed us it's going to be tough for everybody to be at whatever we consider a normal level of productive. But at the same time, I have heard a lot of teams in software organizations talking about how they're suddenly more productive. And
Hmm.
I think there's something, to me, surprising and interesting in that split. And I'm guessing that it has something to do with people's ability to work in a different way when you are distributed, that the sum becomes like greater than the parts in a way that's a little bit less true in person. I'm still figuring that one out.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting distinction. It had never really occurred to me that individuals could be less productive, but their teams could be more productive at the same time. That when we change the way that teams collaborate, and I do wonder how much of that goes back to that point of people focusing more on the work and on the work product as opposed to measuring their success in terms of like how many meetings did we have, how many conversations did we have, whether that actually is leading us to a place where individuals have a little bit more wiggle room to not sort of play the productivity Olympics and still deliver what they need to for their teams.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I know there is something interesting in that. And I think we see it reflected in the fact that a lot of leaders are starting to say, in the after times, whenever that is, we expect that we will support remote work much more robustly than we have in the past. Twitter saying the other day that it can become permanent for people. I think lots of companies are saying we expect more people will work remotely more of the time. And companies wouldn't say that if they didn't see that people could be productive in this mode and teams could be productive in this mode.
yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the coming months. I will say it's been really encouraging for me to see. I think whenever you have an obvious high level shift in the world, it gives teams the opportunity to ask themselves questions that they might not have felt like they needed to or should ask themselves when they were just kind of cranking away towards what they thought they were trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
So it's nice to see that folks are starting to interrogate some of those assumptions and maybe get to a place where the collaborative work can really be what teams drive towards rather than kind of trying to aggregate and compete on the order of individual work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same as what you said before, sort of on a personal level. This requires some introspection personally, and it's an opportunity for that. Same is true for teams. And I think that maybe that's a broader lesson about this whole era. Well, a little early to call the broad lessons, maybe.
And a broader lesson for all eras too.
Yeah.
I see. I'm looking at the event chat, looking at some of your questions. One last thing I wanted to bring up here before we invite Mathilde back to kick us off on our next speed networking. Somebody said, are enough people questioning, this was Nico's question, are enough people questioning Scrum ceremonies in remote setups? Haven't read or heard a lot about that. I certainly have well-documented mixed feelings about Scrum orthodoxy, but I'd be curious, Sarah, being a director in the engineering org and working with folks and having seen this from a lot of different angles. Is this the moment when people finally start to ask why before they do what the Scrum manual tells them to do?
It's a great question. I mean, I agree with you. I think that sort of people aren't asking enough in regular times if we are using these tools, Scrum and other ceremonies properly. My hope is that this, like being in a very different kind of environment for many teams, prompts some questions about what are our goals in using these ceremonies and what are we actually getting out of them? And are there other ways to approach the goals and problems that we have? And that's not to say that we throw Scrum out the window, but there might be some adaptations that are really appropriate in this era. I mean, I think the example before, thinking about the warm up and cool downs, and that it wasn't just that you should do what they did, but they had to iterate a little bit to find what worked for them in this moment. I think that's the thing to think about.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. It was such a pleasure to chat with you.